Chapter 29. The Bee and the Broken Heart. Gopis Viraha. If the Rasa Lila is the height of union in the 10th skanda, the Brahmara Gita, the song to the bee, is its shadow, its depth, its hidden heart. It is the poetry of separation, and in the Bhagavata's devotional theology, Viraha, the pain of separation from Bhagavan, is considered as sacred as, and in some traditions even more sacred than, the joy of union. After Krishna left Vrindavan for Mathura, for reasons we will come to, he sent his friend Uddhava to Vrindavan to console the gopis. Uddhava was the most learned disciple Krishna had, deeply versed in Vedanta, in the philosophy of the Absolute. He arrived carrying Krishna's message of philosophical consolation. The self is eternal, separation is an illusion. He who you love is within you always. The gopis listened to this message, and then Kubja, the most articulate among them, turned to a bee that happened to be circling in the garden, a black bee, like Krishna's complexion, and began to speak to it as if it were Krishna's messenger. What she said in the Brahmara Gita is poetry of devastating power. She said, "Tell your master that we know all his philosophy. We are not uneducated women who do not understand the absolute. But tell us, what use is the knowledge that the self is eternal to a heart that is burning right now? The self may be eternal, but this longing is real. This breath is real. Tell him, if he will not come to us, let him at least send a word, a look, something to keep this life in these bodies until we can see him again." Uddhava stood in silence. This man of great learning, this student of the greatest teacher in the cosmos, stood before the gopis and understood that he had come to teach them and had instead been taught. He fell at their feet. He said, "I thought I knew what bhakti was. I had studied it for years under the Lord himself, and you have just shown me that I knew nothing." The gopis' grief and their love are identical, inseparable. In the Bhagavata's vision, the one who aches for Bhagavan most deeply has already found him most completely. Chapter 30. The Road to Mathura. The time came for Krishna to leave Vrindavan. He was 12 years old. Kamsa had sent Akrura, a devotee of Krishna, a good man placed in an impossible situation, to bring Krishna and Balaram to Mathura for what Kamsa had staged as a great wrestling festival, but which everyone understood was an assassination attempt. The departure was one of the great heartbreaks of the Bhagavata. The gopis came and stood in the road, blocking the chariot, not with force but with their grief. Some simply stood and looked at Krishna, some spoke, some wept without speaking. The older women of Vrindavan watched from doorways. The cows lowed, even the trees seemed to drop their flowers. Krishna spoke to them, gently, warmly, with the complete presence that was his gift to everyone he spoke to. He did not give them philosophy, he did not tell them not to grieve. He said, "I will return." He looked at each face, he tried to carry each face with him. Akrura, driving the chariot, felt the weight of what he was doing and could barely hold the reins. As the chariot crossed the Yamuna, Akrura descended to the river to bathe and found himself in the most extraordinary vision of his life. Underwater, he saw Vishnu in his cosmic form, attended by all the celestials, Shuka and Shesha, and all the divine beings in attendance. He surfaced. He looked at the chariot and saw two ordinary boys. He descended again. Again the vision. He came up, looked at the chariot, and simply began to weep. Because he understood, he was carrying something the universe had never carried before. In Mathura, Krishna and Balarama walked through the city. A washerman refused them royal garments. They took them. A flower maker gave them garlands with his whole heart. Krishna blessed him so thoroughly that he was liberated. A hunchbacked woman who applied sandalwood paste to them was straightened by Krishna's touch and became beautiful. The city that had lived under Kamsa's shadow for years felt something it barely remembered, the presence of joy, free, unafraid, entirely itself. Chapter 31. The Fall of Kamsa. The great wrestling arena of Mathura was packed. Kamsa sat in the royal box above, his jaw tight, his eyes scanning for the boys from Vrindavana. He had arranged everything. Chanura and Mushtika, two wrestlers of superhuman size and strength, waiting in the arena. Mad elephants at every entrance, a city full of his soldiers. Krishna and Balaram walked in. They were 12 years old. They looked around the arena with the curiosity of children who had never seen such a place. Then Chanura stepped forward and invited Krishna to wrestle. What followed was a battle between skill and power, between grace and brute force. Krishna fought Chanura, Balaram fought Mushtika. The crowd, which had been afraid and silent, began to cheer. Here was something they had not allowed themselves to feel in years, the possibility that power could be defeated. Chanura and Mushtika fell. The other wrestlers fled. Kamsa, white-knuckled above, called for his soldiers, called for his elephants. Krishna disposed of the elephant Kuvalayapida with the ease of a child removing an obstacle from his path. Then he leapt to the royal box. Kamsa drew his sword. He had been afraid of this moment for 30 years, and now that it was here, the fear had condensed into a kind of terrible clarity. Krishna caught Kamsa, and in the moment that Kamsa died at Krishna's hands, something extraordinary happened, recorded in the Bhagavata as one of its most theologically significant moments. Kamsa was liberated. Because Kamsa had spent 30 years thinking about Krishna, constantly, obsessively, even though in fear and hatred, his last thought, his last breath contained Krishna. And the Bhagavata says, continuous thought of Bhagavan, even in enmity, produces the same liberation as thought of him in love. Vasudeva and Devaki were freed from prison. Parents and son were reunited after 12 years. Devaki looked at her son and tried to hold him, and then could not quite hold him, because the child who had sent her such despair had come back not merely as her son, but as the Lord of the universe. Chapter 32, Rukmini's Love Letter. Of all the love stories in the Bhagavata, none is more achingly beautiful and none more perfectly structured than the story of Rukmini and Krishna. Rukmini was a princess of Vidarbha, described as possessing every virtue, every grace, every quality that the tradition considers noble in a woman. She had heard of Krishna from wandering sages. She had never seen him, and she had fallen in love with the descriptions. She had fallen in love with someone she had never met. Her brother Rukmi, blinded by pride and politics, had pledged her in marriage to Shishupala, an enemy of Krishna, a man Rukmini did not love and could not honor. The wedding preparations were underway. The date was set. Rukmini sat in her chambers and did the only thing she could think of. She wrote a letter. She wrote it to Krishna. She gave it to a Brahmin messenger and told him to find the Lord. The letter, preserved in the Bhagavata in some of the most beautiful Sanskrit in the entire text, says, I have heard of your qualities and I have lost my heart to you. I know no other. If I am not united with you, I will not have lived. But know this, you must come to me not as a guest, but as a rescuer. There is a temple of Devi at the edge of the city where I will go on the eve of the wedding. That is where you must come. Krishna read the letter. He held it. He looked at the messenger. Something in his expression made the Brahmin understand that the waiting was over. Krishna arrived at Vidarbha with Balaram. As Rukmini walked from the temple, in full view of the assembled kings who had come for her wedding, in full view of Rukmi who had sworn to defeat Krishna, Krishna drove his chariot alongside her, took her hand, and lifted her aboard. She came with him, not taken against her will, but rescued exactly as she had asked. Rukmi chased them. Krishna defeated him without killing him, sparing him at Rukmini's request, because even on the day of her deliverance, she did not want her brother's blood on this joy. Chapter 33, The Lord of 16,108 Queens. The demon Narakasura had accumulated power and had used it in the worst possible way. He had abducted 16,100 women from their homes, their families, their kingdoms, and imprisoned them in his palace. They were not enslaved for his pleasure. He simply wanted to possess what was precious to others. His castle was full of the grief of women who had no hope. When Krishna was told of this, he went with his wife Satyabhama, who rode beside him on Garuda for this particular battle, a warrior queen in her own right. The battle with Narakasura was fierce but decisive. Narakasura fell. The 16,100 women were freed. But here is where the story becomes extraordinary. These women had no home to return to. In the social order of the time, women who had been held in a demon's palace, even against their will, even without any fault of their own, would face impossible conditions if they returned to their families or kingdoms. The world would not receive them as it should. Krishna married them all 16,100. He established each of them in a palace, and this is the moment the Bhagavata records with quiet emphasis. He simultaneously appeared in each of those 16,000 palaces, not as a divided presence, not as a representative, but as himself, complete and undivided, in each place at once. Narada, ever curious, visited each palace to check. In every palace, he found the same Krishna, fully present, fully engaged, attending to the particular needs and joys and sorrows of that particular woman. Not distracted, not elsewhere, there, with her, completely. The Bhagavata offers this episode as a teaching on omnipresence, not as a philosophical concept, but as a lived reality. Bhagavan is not divided when he is present in many places simultaneously. The sun does not diminish when it shines in 1,000 pots of water at once. Each pot receives the full sun. Each soul receives the full Bhagavan. Chapter 34 Sudama, a handful of rice. Sudama had been Krishna's classmate at the ashram of the sage Sandipani, two boys studying together, eating together, gathering firewood together in the forest. They had been friends in the way that can only happen in childhood, completely, without hierarchy, without agenda. That was long ago. Now Krishna was the king of Dwarka, the most powerful figure in the known world, and Sudama was nothing. A poor brahmin in a small village with a leaking roof and children who went to bed hungry. His wife finally said, "Go to Krishna, he loves you, ask for help." Sudama was reluctant. One does not go to a childhood friend to beg, but his wife's face stopped his pride. He went. He walked to Dwarka carrying what he could afford to bring as a gift: a small cloth bundle of poha, flattened rice, the simplest food in any Indian kitchen. He tied it tightly and hid it under his arm, ashamed. When Krishna heard that Sudama had arrived, he left his court. He ran to the gate. He embraced Sudama the way you embrace someone you have loved since childhood and have missed without knowing how much. He brought Sudama into his palace. He sat him down on his own bed. He washed Sudama's feet, the Lord of the universe washing the cracked, dusty feet of a poor Brahmin. Rukmini held the lamp. The attendants stood astonished. Krishna noticed the bundle. He took it. He unwrapped the flattened rice and ate it with delight. "Ah," he said, "this is the finest thing I have tasted." He ate one handful, two handfuls, and Rukmini caught his wrist at the third. Two handfuls gives him all the wealth of this world. If you eat a third, you will give him what transcends wealth. They talked all night, not about poverty or wealth, about the ashram, about the teacher, about the firewood in the rain, about being 12 years old and the world being simple. Sudama returned home not knowing what to expect. His village had disappeared. In its place stood a palace, not for a king but for a man, with a garden and clean water and enough for his children and their children. He had received everything without asking for anything. Chapter 35 Dwarka, Syamantaka, and the Great War. Life in Dwarka was not merely courtly grandeur. The 10th skanda shows us a Krishna whose days were full of the complicated, sometimes comic, sometimes painful realities of power, family, and the demands of dharma in a world that was hurtling toward catastrophe. The Syamantaka episode is one of the most humanly interesting in the entire Bhagavata. The gem Syamantaka had been given to the Yadava nobleman Satrajit by the sun god. It was a divine jewel that produced gold daily. When it disappeared, rumor pointed to Krishna. He had not taken it, but the rumor spread, and Krishna, who knew what reputations mean in the world of governance, investigated it personally, traced it through the forest to its unlikely location with a bear king named Jambavan, fought Jambavan for 21 days deep in a cave, and recovered both the gem and Jambavan's daughter Jambavati, who became another of his wives. He returned the gem to Satrajit. He did not need to, since he had been innocent. He did it because dharma required that the slander be publicly and completely refuted. A king cannot allow false accusation to rest. Among the other remarkable events of Krishna's Dwarka years, he brought the Parijata tree, the divine wish-fulfilling tree of the celestials, from Indra's heaven for Satyabhama, leading to another of his playful confrontations with the king of gods. He defeated the demon Banasura, a devotee of Shiva with 1,000 arms, when Banasura captured Aniruddha, Krishna's own grandson, leading to an extraordinary encounter in which Krishna and Shiva themselves came face to face in battle. It was not a true conflict, because Shiva, who is a great Vaishnava, ultimately revealed himself as devoted to the same Bhagavan he appeared to oppose. The message is classic Bhagavata. All apparent opposition between the great deities resolves into the recognition of one underlying reality. As Kurukshetra approached, Krishna's role was the most delicate in all of human history. He was related to both sides. He loved both sides. He sent his army to the Kauravas and went himself, unarmed, as charioteer to Arjun. The greatest warrior on earth chose to drive a chariot rather than fight, which tells us everything about how Krishna understood the difference between power and purpose. On the battlefield, when Arjuna dropped his bow in despair and grief, Krishna spoke. What he said over the next 18 chapters of the Mahabharata is the Bhagavad Gita, the most luminous philosophical conversation in all of human literature. The Bhagavata references this moment simply, quietly, the way you reference something everyone already knows in their bones. The Lord spoke. Dharma was restored.